For this assignment for the theory to practice, instead of just presenting or providing the file of the presentation, I did two things. I combined an oral versus a visual presentation. So I'm going to be doing this orally connected to the assignment, but there's an attachment to it as well for the presentation that you can follow through along and just have an idea of the information I'm providing. So first slide is going to be provided to you. We'll have just the theory of practice title. The second slide is the definition of what is differentiation. So the differentiation instruction, the understanding that each child may learn differently and adapting lessons and coursework to those learning styles. So you're essentially basing the instruction off of whatever the students have learned or are interested in and following through with teaching those students in that method, way, shape, or form. A lot of ways that I like to do this is doing observable first, watching the students and what they like, what they're interested in, what subject matter they tend to have an easier time understanding, and using that for the instruction that they might have a difficult time with. The second component is the theory of transformational learning, which dictates how people make sense of the world through experiences and asking questions that relate to those experiences. So essentially what you do is you take what they've learned out in the world and create a sense of understanding through their experiences first. For instance, in a classroom that I've worked with is providing readings that the children have talked about personally with me in the classroom about issues or things that they worry about as teenagers, and then providing texts that support those claims or maybe make them think even more critically about the same subject matters that they're interested in. We then have inclusion education. Essentially what this states is the educational practice in which involvement of all students, regardless of background, class, needs, deserves to be included in activities, teachings of the classroom and outside of the classroom. Essentially what you're trying to say is regardless of where the child comes from, physically, emotionally, socioeconomically, whatever the case may be, it shouldn't matter when involving in supporting students. They should all be treated equally in that sense and be given the proper help if they need it. A big example of this in the classroom is taking into consideration each child's backgrounds. So adapting to the ability that a child might be more sensitive emotionally due to the trauma they faced versus another child who might be more receptive to actually receiving criticism and adapting new materials so that they can understand further, or maybe it's too easy for them, so then you make the subject matter a little more difficult so that it challenges them. It's just taking into account that each child learns differently and using that as an advantage to support the child. We then have social emotional learning theory. I myself actually worked for years as a school climate advocate, which I took about maybe 4 or 5 courses and training with social emotional learning. It entails that the process of learning emotional cues, self-regulation, and other factors that entail emotions being the driving force. Essentially, you're supporting self-regulation of the child's emotions, happy, angry, whatever the mood may be. But it's also important to encompass that in this same subject, it's also talking about, for instance, learning to greet each other when you see somebody, just having a conversation with others, which is becoming very hard, especially during our times online due to the pandemic and whatnot, providing situations in which they learn to converse and communicate with one another, and then social media and technology kind of handicaps that, unfortunately, and so creating methods to do so and supporting their emotional growth is also just as important as the educational one. The biggest example I like is the one we used at a classroom that I was working with is in order to earn maybe a few extra points of credit or whatnot, the entire group would come up with a random story based on 4 or 5 different words provided to them, and each student had to provide their own funny little sentence to the paragraph. And it encourages them to want to be sillier, funnier, random, in the same paragraph, working together and socializing without even realizing it at times. We then have constructivism theory. So the construction of knowledge based on the ideas brought together by the experiences the individual has had. So it's a little like the other one that we discussed, in which you're basing it off the experience the child has had. The only difference is that instead of just flowing directly through whatever's happened to them in their experiences, in this one, based on the experience that they've had, they built a summary or a goal or a reasoning behind certain things based on the experiences that they've had. So, for instance, for good or for bad, you might have students who have dealt with hard times, either financially or familial, whatever the case may be, and the student can take that one of two ways, right? Can learn to either feel like that's the only thing they have, there's no escape, but for some circumstances, actually, it's the opposite. The child will feel like they need to push themselves to get away from that situation, um, adhere to trying to adapt and be a better person, or the case may be. Another way you can use it is just, even just for subject matter, basing it on the past examples that they've had. So for math, for instance, if at the beginning of the year they've had a hard time with the same assignment over and over again, right? You take it away for a while, you bring it back, and you show it again a different way, and then you let the child see the differences that have gone throughout the year, right? They may still not know the answer to the question, but they might know steps 1, 2, 3 out of 5 steps. That creates a constructive idea in their heads that states, you know what, I'm building up to that format of learning all 5 steps, but at least I've built up or constructed 3 methods. We then have behaviorism. Essentially, behavior is learned through the experience an individual has through life or growing. So it's similar to the other one as well. The only difference is that it's based more on the behavior that is experienced, not this whole situation itself. So it has to do more with the interactions that people have with one another. If your interactions with one another is always having, somebody yell at you or be sad or be happy, those tend to have a huge influence in the way you learn. So if somebody talks to you in a little more stern way, somebody who's been dealing with that all their life might take that to offense, or might get upset or feel sad. Somebody who's been given the opportunity to have parents who are accommodating and are willing to work with a child, then having a teacher who does that as well is obviously more supportive for the child. Cognitivism, it's the way information is processed, delivered, and kept in the brain. Honestly, scientifically, I'm not too educated in this, but essentially it's how we keep those ideas in our head. So short term, it stays for like a few seconds. Long term, obviously, is processed, and the more you practice it, the more it stays in your head. And it's also those ideas that have stayed in your head that also make you think of scenarios that you're currently being dealt with in your life experiences. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you. I appreciate it.